suits in August, and then I'm like, oh crap, he used the Edmund Burke quote. I gotta like get a new one. So the thing about history and cities, if you look at them long enough, is that they grow on top of each other, and what happened in the past impacts always what happens in the present and the future. And I had a really great visual experience of that this summer. I was lucky enough to go to Barcelona. And in Barcelona is the third oldest synagogue that is still being used. And if you don't know where to look, you're not going to find it. It was initially built, they think, in the Roman times, in the 3rd or 4th century CE. And I think that because there is a cornerstone still there with an 18 inscribed in it in Latin, in the Roman numerals. And it was the lowest level of the site. And it was lost. The synagogue was lost. If you know anything about European history, you know that in 1492, Spain kicked out all the Jews, the expulsion. And from that time forward, the synagogue was lost. Until in the 90s, somebody found a tax record, because taxes are permanent. They found a tax record describing not only this synagogue, but 3 others, and the area in Barcelona that had been the Jewish quarter. So somebody, I can't remember the name of the person, got together a group of people, and they waited until one of these buildings went on sale. And they bought the building under which this ancient synagogue was. And they weren't even sure if anything was still going to be there. And then they got the building, and they dug it out, and there it was. There was the synagogue that had last been used in the 1400s. And they could tell the wall that was facing east. That they could see where the Torah had been kept. They wanted to get the women's section, but unfortunately it was under another building that a restaurant was on top of. And if you're lucky, you can go to that restaurant and sneak down into the bathrooms and see the wall where it is, but you can't actually access it. But I went there with my sons, who could read, thanks to their day school education, the Hebrew written on the walls. My rising second grader and 5th grader, even the parts that didn't have vowels, they were sitting there reading it out. And the amazing thing about the synagogue was that it was 8 feet underground. There was a tiny door, and you had to walk down these steps. But when it had initially been built, that was the level of the street. And so even though history had buried this not incredible, not sweeping, not amazing, objectively piece of architecture, it was still there. Like what is behind us right now, what the Keeping Tabs sculpture is it is something that is still there because we are still here. As a Jewish people, we sadly but rightly define a lot of our experience by the struggles that we have survived. But survived them we have. And that survival is the key. And when I looked at the Hebrew written on the wall of a 13th century, 14th century building that my children could read, I thought about the school that they go to and what marks it publicly, clearly, not hiding underground, not buried by history. I was proud. And we came back to the States. And everything was fine. And then it wasn't. And then we have had the past few weeks. We've had a few months of all of this, where we have seen things and heard things and we say, no. How many of you have had that thought? No. They did not just say that. No. No, it's 2017. reminded again of the fact that we have heard people say these things for centuries and decades. And now, in the past couple of days, and we think to ourselves, how? It's 2017. How have we not gone past this? And yet we as Jews, as a Jewish people, as a community, beyond just the Jews in the world, marginalized people of all sorts, people of color, women, people who are trans, people who just think a little differently, are yet demonized, even though we are told that it's the 21st century. As Jews, we look back on the story of Abraham and Sarah, who opened their tent in all four directions so that they could see strangers coming, so they could welcome them in. Abraham stopped talking to God, which he did with Abraham. Better lines of communication back then. To serve three strangers who came by, to wash their feet, to give them food. They were angels, but he didn't know that at the time. We are told as Jews to beat swords into plowshares. And in fact, we are told, I keep saying this, but we're told as human beings to beat swords into plowshares. We are told to be active. And that's what it comes down to. We don't just sit idly by. We are told to reach out to our brethren, to our sisters in the world, to our brothers, to the people who may have less than us, the people who are strangers because we were strangers in a strange land. We are told that it is not just a good idea, it is what we are put here to do. And then there are people who say, be patient and wait. And they say, it'll get better. It's fine. Don't worry about it. When John Lewis spoke at the 1963 March on Washington, he said, we are told to be patient and wait, but we will not be patient. We will not wait. I'm assuming everybody knows who John Lewis is. If you don't, he is, I believe, or should be the moral compass of America and the world at large. If John Lewis doesn't like what you are saying, you are on the wrong side of history. I could talk about John Lewis for a while, but I'm not gonna. He said, wake up, America. For we cannot stop, and we will not and cannot be patient. And that is what this is, what you are, what this is. We will not be patient. We will not sit idly by as people equivocate and say, oh, one side and the other side, they're the same. There are good people and bad people on both sides. That is not the case. That is not the case in the world, and that is not the case at CDS. We are not afraid to make moral and virtuous decisions. Human rights are Jewish values. We teach our children, our students, to go out, to make good decisions, to be upstanders. We have an entire curriculum, the Facing History curriculum, dedicated to the notion that people make choices and choices make history. And we are all at a watershed event in our lives that we did not ever think that we would be at. We did not think we would have to make these choices again because the choices have been made, the price has been paid, blood has been shed, and yet we find ourselves again in the 21st century fighting a battle that should have been done and gone decades ago. A friend of mine shared a picture of a Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden in the 1930s. We forget sometimes that, frighteningly enough, these ideas are not strangers to America. We may see them as being un-American, but they're not strangers. The ideas of hate and prejudice and bigotry are not strange in the United States. So sadly, when we say this could never happen in America, we're not telling ourselves the truth. And it is a sad and shameful thing that we still have to be having this conversation. But have it we will. I encourage you, have it with your children. Have it with your grandchildren. Have it with kids, because honestly, in dark times, I've said this to my students, in dark times, my students are what give me hope. The young people that I see every day, the young people who got letters back from the governor because they wrote a letter to the governor saying, I don't like this, or I don't appreciate this, or they wrote a letter to a senator, or they flooded a senator's office with emails and faxes and phone calls. When they gave up their lunch and recess because they're like, hey, Steinberg, can we call our senator? I'm like, yeah. When as a social studies teacher says, here's a student say, can I call my senator? I'm like, yes. That's a win. In fact, I'll say this. Bill, I know a former student of yours, and she used to work on Capitol Hill. And she said, you're teaching CDS? Mr. Walterstrom? He made me want to work for Congress. He made me want to work in the government. Because government is not a bad thing. Politics are not a bad thing. We are a society of laws and people who care. And that's what our students are for. And that is why, even in the darkest day, and there was a dark day this week. There was a dark day, and there is no pretending otherwise. I have hope, because I see 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds saying, I'm not going to be quiet. I'm going to go to Washington. I'm going to work for the government. When I see something, I'm going to say something. And they don't back down. So I'm going to leave you with a quote, my favorite quote. It's on the door of my room. It's my room now. I don't know how you fit so many fish tanks in there. This was a Canadian politician who died 2 months after winning a huge election. It was Jack Layton. And in his letter saying goodbye, he didn't tell anybody. Nobody knew that he had gone through an entire campaign with stage 4 cancer. When he died, he wrote a letter saying, apologizing that he wouldn't be there, that he wouldn't see the mountain. He was on the mountain. He wouldn't see the promised land, but he said, my friends, love is better than anger. Hope is better than fear. Optimism is better than despair. So let us be loving, hopeful, and optimistic, and we'll change the world.